The billionaire CEO was about to have the homeless woman removed from his property when she suddenly grabbed his wrist. Her grip was weak but determined, and then she whispered something so precise, so impossible, that it made his blood run cold. "I know about the birthmark on your left shoulder," she said, "the one shaped like a crescent moon." Alexander Sterling froze. That mark was his secret. Something he had hidden under tailored suits his entire life. Something only doctors, and one other person, should have known. What he would discover in the next few days would shatter everything he believed about his perfect life. And the truth? It didn't begin today. It began 35 years ago, with a lie that destroyed 2 lives. Alexander Sterling was American royalty. At 35 years old, he had built a technology empire valued at $2 billion. His face appeared on the covers of Forbes, Time, and Fortune. His penthouse overlooked Central Park from the 68th floor. His cars were custom-built. His watches cost more than most people earned in a year. He was what people called the American dream made flesh. The self-made tech genius, the visionary entrepreneur, the man who could turn ideas into gold. But there was a secret behind the perfect facade. Alexander Sterling wasn't self-made at all. Adopted at birth by Richard and Victoria Sterling, old money, Connecticut elite, Alexander never wanted for anything. Private schools where tuition cost 6 figures. Elite tutors flown in from Oxford and Cambridge, Yale at 18, Harvard Business School at 23. A trust fund so large it could erase generations of poverty with a single wire transfer. Every door opened before he even knocked. Every failure was cushioned by millions. Every risk was backed by a safety net most people couldn't even imagine. And yet, there was always something missing. A hollow space inside him that no success ever filled. A silence that followed him through boardrooms, galas, and award ceremonies. An emptiness that whispered late at night when the city slept and he stared at the ceiling. You don't know who you really are. He never knew his biological mother, and for most of his life he never wanted to. The Sterlings told him she was young, poor, unprepared to be a parent. They said they had saved him from a life of poverty and struggle. That was the story he believed for 35 years. Until a cold November morning changed everything. November 12th, 7:47 a.m. The temperature was 38 degrees, and the wind coming off the East River cut through the Manhattan streets like a knife. Alexander was leaving his office building on 5th Avenue. Sterling Tower, 43 stories of glass and steel with his name carved in marble at the entrance. He was checking his phone, scrolling through emails, barely paying attention to the world around him. That's when he nearly tripped over her. A homeless woman sat against the marble wall of his building, wrapped in layers of worn coats that looked like they hadn't been washed in months. A wool hat covered most of her gray hair. Her hands, cracked and red from the cold, held a cardboard sign that read, "Hungry. Anything helps. God bless." Alexander felt the familiar reaction rise inside him. Discomfort mixed with distant pity. A slight tightening in his chest. The urge to look away. He saw homelessness every day in Manhattan. On subway platforms, in doorways, on park benches. It was part of the city's landscape, like yellow cabs and steam rising from manhole covers. Usually he ignored it. Sometimes, if the guilt became too heavy, he would have his assistant donate to a shelter. $5,000 here, $10,000 there. Enough to ease his conscience without requiring actual involvement. But he never engaged, never looked them in the eye, never saw them as people with stories, with histories, with names. "Ma'am, you can't stay here," he said firmly, his voice carrying the tone of someone used to being obeyed. "This is private property." The woman slowly lifted her head. And when their eyes met, something shifted in the air. Her face was weathered by years of cold, hunger, and disappointment. Deep lines carved paths across her forehead and around her mouth. Her skin was rough, damaged by sun and wind and harsh weather. She looked 60, maybe older, though it was hard to tell. Life on the streets aged people in ways that defied normal measurement. But her eyes were different, sharp, focused, intelligent. The eyes of someone who had seen too much but refused to look away. "Mr. Sterling?" she said softly. He stopped mid-reach for his phone. "How do you know my name?" "Everyone knows your name," she replied, her voice hoarse but steady. "You're everywhere. Billboards, magazines, television." She gestured weakly toward the building behind him. "This is your building. Your name is carved on the front." Alexander exhaled impatiently. His driver was waiting. He had a board meeting in 40 minutes. He didn't have time for this. "Right. Well, you still need to leave. I'll call security if... I've been looking for you for 3 years. His hand paused halfway to his phone. "Excuse me?" She struggled to stand, her movement slow and painful, like every joint in her body was screaming in protest. When she finally got to her feet, she was shorter than he expected, maybe 5'4", small and frail in a way that made her previous determination even more striking. "Please," she said, and there was something in her voice that cut through his impatience. "Just 5 minutes. That's all I ask." "I don't have 5 minutes," Alexander replied, his tone cold and dismissive. "And I don't give money to... I don't want your money." Her voice hardened, gaining strength. "I want to tell you the truth about who you are." Something in her tone made him hesitate. Not the words themselves, but the way she said them. With certainty, with knowledge, with the weight of something that couldn't be dismissed as the rambling of someone mentally unstable. "What are you talking about?" With trembling hands, from cold or emotion he couldn't tell, she reached deep into her coat. For a moment, Alexander tensed, some primitive part of his brain imagining danger, but what she pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was a photograph, old, creased, faded by time and handling. The edges were worn soft, as if it had been held thousands of times, protected, treasured. "Do you recognize this baby?" she asked, holding it out to him. Alexander looked down, and his heart nearly stopped. A hospital photo, the kind they take in the first few hours after birth. A newborn wrapped in a blue blanket, face red and scrunched, eyes closed. And there, on the baby's left shoulder, visible above the edge of the blanket, unmistakable, impossible to ignore, a crescent moon-shaped birthmark. The exact same birthmark Alexander had on his left shoulder, the one he'd been self-conscious about as a child. The one he'd asked his mother about when he was 7, wondering if it would ever go away. The one he now kept hidden under expensive suits and custom-tailored shirts. The birthmark only he, his doctors, and his parents knew about. "Where did you get this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the traffic noise. Tears filled her eyes, spilling over and running down her weathered cheeks. "Because I took it," she said, her voice breaking. 35 years ago, at Mount Sinai Hospital, 2 hours after you were born." The world tilted beneath his feet. The sounds of the city, car horns, sirens, voices, seemed to fade into a distant hum. "What are you saying?" "My name is Margaret Sullivan," she said, each word deliberate, heavy with truth. "And I am your mother." Alexander stepped back as if she had struck him. "You're insane!" "I'm not," Margaret replied, her voice surprisingly calm now. "I know what you think. I know how this looks. A homeless woman with a wild story and an old photo. But I'm telling you the truth." "My mother is Victoria Sterling," Alexander snapped, anger rising in his chest. "She's at home in Connecticut right now. My birth mother was a teenage girl who gave me up for adoption because she couldn't take care of me. That's what I was told. That's what happened." Margaret shook her head slowly, sadly. "That was the lie they told you. Stop. I was 23 years old, she continued, her voice gaining strength. Not a teenager. I was a registered nurse at Mount Sinai Hospital. I had a job, a steady income, a one-bedroom apartment in Queens. I wanted you more than anything in the world. Then why didn't you keep me? Alexander demanded, his voice rising. People passing on the sidewalk were starting to stare, but he didn't care. Because they took you from me. The words hung in the cold morning air. Alexander felt his pulse pounding in his ears. Who took me? The Sterlings, Margaret whispered. Your adoptive parents. They paid people at the hospital, paid lawyers, paid judges, changed records, forged documents, made me look unfit to be a mother. By the time I understood what was happening, you were already gone, legally theirs. And I was just a poor nurse with no money for lawyers to fight billionaires. Alexander's anger surged like a tidal wave. This is ridiculous. Do you know how many people try to scam me every single week? People with sob stories and convenient photos and claims about being my long-lost relative? This is Manhattan. Everyone wants something. I'm not scamming you, Margaret said quietly. Security! Alexander shouted. 2 guards emerged from the building's entrance, moving quickly toward them. They knew their job. Remove problems. Protect Mr. Sterling. Ask questions later. Margaret grabbed his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong despite her frail appearance. Please, she begged. Just check your adoption papers. Ask them about Mount Sinai Hospital. Ask them about Margaret Sullivan. Ask them about the birthmark. Remove her, Alexander said coldly, pulling his arm free. As the guards took hold of Margaret's arms, she didn't resist. But she screamed, her voice cutting through the morning air like a siren. Your father's name was David Murphy. He was a construction worker. He died in an accident 6 months before you were born. I named you James David Murphy. I held you for 2 hours before they took you. Alexander froze. His entire body went rigid. At 12 years old, exploring his father's study when he was supposed to be doing homework, he had found a locked drawer in Richard Sterling's mahogany desk. Being 12 and curious, he'd picked the lock with a paperclip, a skill he'd learned from a YouTube video. Inside, among various legal documents and old contracts, he'd found a birth certificate, original, sealed, marked confidential. The name on it, James David Murphy, born March 15, 1989, Mount Sinai Hospital. Mother, Margaret Sullivan. Father, David Murphy, deceased. He'd never told anyone about finding it. When his father had discovered the drawer open later that week, Alexander had lied, said he was looking for paper for a school project. Richard had believed him, or pretended to. But that name, James Murphy, had haunted him for 23 years. How could this woman possibly know it? Wait, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The guard stopped, still holding Margaret's arms. Alexander turned slowly. How do you know that name? Margaret was crying now, tears streaming down her weathered face, her body shaking. Because I chose it. I held you against my chest for 2 precious hours, and I whispered it to you over and over. James, my sweet James, I sang to you. I told you I loved you. I promised you I would never let you go. She sobbed. And then they took you anyway. Something inside Alexander cracked. Not broke, not yet, but cracked, like ice on a frozen lake when the temperature starts to rise. I need proof, he said hoarsely. Real proof. Not stories, not old photographs, DNA. Margaret nodded desperately. Yes, please. Test me. I've been trying to get you to test me for 3 years. Your lawyers always throw away my letters. Your assistants hang up when I call. Your security guards chase me away every time I come here. But I keep trying. I'll never stop trying. Alexander pulled out his phone with trembling hands. I'll have my assistant arrange it. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., there's a private lab on the Upper East Side. If you're lying... I'm not lying, Margaret said softly with absolute certainty. "I've never stopped looking for you, James. Never stopped hoping I'd find you before I died." That night, Alexander didn't sleep. He stood in his penthouse, 58 floors above the city, staring at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows. Behind his reflection, Manhattan glittered like a field of diamonds. Thousands of lights, millions of lives, each window a story, each story a universe. And somewhere down there, in that vast sea of humanity, a woman who claimed to be his mother was sleeping in a hotel room he'd paid for. He'd sent her there immediately after their conversation, called his assistant, arranged a suite at a mid-range hotel in Midtown, paid for 3 nights, ordered room service, had clothes delivered from a nearby department store. It was the least he could do while waiting for the DNA results. But part of him, a large part, hoped the test would prove her wrong. Prove she was just another con artist with a good story and a lucky guess. Because if she was telling the truth, if she was really his mother, if everything he'd been told his entire life was a lie, then who was he? His phone rang. Marcus Chen, head of security, former FBI agent, the only person Alexander trusted absolutely. Marcus. "Boss, I got your message. You want me to investigate a Margaret Sullivan?" "Yes. Born around 1966, probably in New York. Worked as a nurse at Mount Sinai Hospital in the late 80s. And Marcus, I need you to pull my sealed adoption records." There was a long pause on the other end. "Your adoption records are sealed by court order. I'd need to—" "I don't care what you need to do," Alexander interrupted. "Get them." Another pause. "Alexander, is everything okay?" "No," Alexander said quietly, his voice raw. "Nothing's okay. I met a woman today who says she's my biological mother. She knows things, Marcus, things she shouldn't know. The name on my original birth certificate, details about my birth, and she has a photo of me as a newborn with my birthmark visible. Could be a scam. Someone with access to old hospital records. I know. That's why I'm doing DNA. Results come back tomorrow. But Marcus, I need to know the truth. All of it. Because if she's telling the truth, that means my parents, the Sterlings, they lied to me. For 35 years. "I'll start digging," Marcus said. "Give me 48 hours. Alexander hung up and returned to the window. His reflection stared back at him. Expensive suit, perfect hair, the face of success. But underneath, who was he really? Alexander Sterling, billionaire? Or James Murphy, the stolen son of a nurse? The DNA results came back in 48 hours. Alexander sat in his corner office on the 40th floor of Sterling Tower, staring at the document on his desk. Lab results. Confidential client. Alexander Sterling test subject. Margaret Sullivan relationship. Probability, 99. 9% conclusion. Margaret Sullivan is the biological mother of Alexander Sterling. 99. 9%. Alexander read it 3 times. Then 4, then 5. As if the numbers would change if he looked at them long enough. They didn't. Margaret Sullivan was his biological mother. His hands were shaking. His chest felt tight. The room seemed to spin slightly, as if the foundation of reality itself had shifted. His assistant knocked gently on the door. "Mr. Sterling, Marcus Chen is here. He says it's urgent." "Send him in." Marcus entered, carrying a thick folder. His expression was grim. He'd been with Alexander for 8 years, and Alexander had never seen him look this serious. "You found something?" "Yeah." Marcus sat down heavily in one of the leather chairs across from Alexander's desk. "And boss, you're really not going to like it." He opened the folder and spread documents across the polished mahogany, hospital records, legal documents, bank statements, transcripts. Margaret Sullivan, born 1966 in Queens, New York. Graduated from Hunter College with a nursing degree in 1987. Started working at Mount Sinai Hospital in 1985 while still in school. By 1989, she was a full-time registered nurse in the pediatric ward. Exemplary record, multiple commendations, no disciplinary actions, no criminal history, no drug use, no mental health red flags. Marcus pulled out another document. In March 1989, she gave birth to a son, James David Murphy. Father was David Murphy, a construction worker who died in a workplace accident 6 months earlier. According to hospital records, Margaret was planning to keep the baby. She had an apartment, steady income, maternity leave approved. Everything lined up perfectly for her to be a single mother. So what happened? Alexander's voice was barely above a whisper. Marcus's jaw tightened. 2 days after the birth, a lawyer named Harrison Whitmore, who worked for Sterling and Associates, your father's firm, filed emergency custody papers in family court. The papers claimed Margaret had a history of drug abuse, claimed she had untreated mental illness, claimed she'd exhibited erratic behavior at the hospital, claimed she was a danger to the child. That's impossible. You just said— It was all fabricated, Marcus interrupted. I found the original hospital psychiatric evaluation. Dr. Sarah Chen evaluated Margaret Sullivan 48 hours after giving birth. The evaluation states, and I quote, "Patient shows no signs of postpartum depression or psychosis. Affect is appropriate. Patient is mentally sound and capable of caring for infant." He pulled out another document. But this evaluation never made it to family court. Instead, a different evaluation appeared in the court records. One signed by a Dr. James Thornton claiming Margaret was mentally unstable, had attempted to harm the infant, and posed a serious risk. Who's Dr. Thornton? Doesn't exist. I ran every database. No record of a Dr. James Thornton ever being licensed in New York. It was a forgery. Alexander felt sick. My father did this. Marcus nodded slowly. Your father paid off a family court judge, Judge William Bradford. I found the bank records. 1 week before the emergency custody hearing, Judge Bradford received a wire transfer of $250,000 from an offshore account traced back to Richard Sterling. 1 week after the hearing, another $250,000. And the hearing lasted 17 minutes. Margaret didn't even have a lawyer. She couldn't afford one. She showed up alone, confused, not understanding what was happening. The judge reviewed the fake evaluation, declared her unfit, and granted temporary custody to Richard and Victoria Sterling pending adoption finalization. Marcus pulled out more papers. Margaret tried to fight it. She hired a public defender, filed appeals, but every door closed in her face. Every judge sided with the Sterlings. Every lawyer she consulted told her she had no chance. She spent every penny she had on legal fees. Eventually lost her job at the hospital because she missed too much work dealing with court dates. Lost her apartment. By 1991, she was living in her car. By 1992, she was on the streets. And she's been there ever since. The room was completely silent except for the quiet hum of the air conditioning. 35 years, Alexander whispered. She's been homeless for 35 years because my parents stole her son. Not just stole, Marcus said quietly. Destroyed. They destroyed her entire life to get what they wanted, a child. Alexander stood abruptly, his chair rolling backward. I need to see her, right now. Margaret was still at the hotel. She'd been waiting, not knowing if Alexander would ever come back. When she opened the door and saw him standing there, her eyes widened with hope and fear. The DNA test, Alexander said without preamble. It's positive. You're my biological mother. Margaret's knees buckled. She grabbed the doorframe for support, tears immediately streaming down her face. Thank God, she whispered. Thank God you know the truth. They stood in the doorway for a long moment. This mother and son. Strangers connected by blood, but separated by decades of lies. Can I come in? Alexander asked. Margaret stepped aside quickly. Yes, Yes, of course, I'm sorry, The hotel room was modest, clean but generic. Margaret had been living here for 3 days, and it looked like she still couldn't believe it was real. The bed was perfectly made, the towels unused. She'd been sleeping on top of the covers, afraid to disturb anything. Alexander sat in the desk chair. Margaret perched on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped in her lap, nervous. I also had my head of security investigate, Alexander said. He found everything, the forged documents, the fake psychiatric evaluation, the bribes, all of it. Margaret nodded slowly. I tried to tell people, I tried to make them listen, but who believes a poor nurse over billionaires? Why didn't you give up? The question came out harsher than Alexander intended. 35 years on the streets. Why didn't you just move on? Start a new life somewhere else? Margaret looked at him with those sharp, intelligent eyes he suddenly realized looked exactly like his own. Because you were my son, my baby. They took you from me, but they couldn't take you from my heart. Every single day for 35 years, I woke up and thought, maybe today I'll find him. Maybe today he'll know the truth. You could have had a life, Alexander said, his voice tight with emotion. You were a nurse. You could have moved to another city, started over, found happiness. I did have a life, Margaret said softly. It just wasn't the one I planned, but I never stopped looking for you, James. The name hit him like a physical blow. Don't call me that. That's your name, the name I gave you. My name is Alexander Sterling. That's who I've been for 35 years. No, Margaret said gently. That's who they made you. James David Murphy is who you were born to be. Alexander stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, New York continued its endless movement. Cars, people, lives intersecting and diverging. I don't know how to process this, he said. I don't know what to feel. Angry, grateful, betrayed, all of it. You don't have to know right now, Margaret said. You can feel everything. You're allowed to be confused. You're allowed to be angry. Alexander turned to face her. Tell me about the day I was born. Margaret's face softened. You really want to know? Yes. She took a deep breath, and for the first time since he'd met her, Alexander saw past the weathered exterior to the woman she must have been, young, hopeful, full of dreams. You were born at 3:47 in the morning on March 15th, 1989, she began. It was raining. I remember because I could hear it hitting the hospital windows. I'd been in labor for 11 hours. It was hard. You were my first baby and I was alone. Your father had died 6 months earlier, and I didn't have family to call. Her voice grew tender. But the moment they placed you in my arms, everything else disappeared. You were 7 pounds, 3 ounces. You had a full head of dark hair, just like David. And you looked up at me with these huge dark eyes, your father's eyes, and you didn't cry. You just stared at me like you were trying to memorize my face. Tears rolled down Margaret's cheeks. I held you against my chest and I sang to you. You are my sunshine. It was my mother's favorite song. She died when I was 16, and singing it made me feel like she was there with us, like she was meeting her grandson. Alexander felt his own eyes burning. What else? You fell asleep with your tiny hand wrapped around my finger. I counted your fingers, your toes. I kissed your forehead. I told you about your father. What a good man he was. How much he would have loved you. I told you about all the things we were going to do together. I was going to teach you to read, take you to the park, show you the ocean. Her voice broke. I had 2 hours with you before they took you for routine tests. When the nurse brought you back, you had this little hospital bracelet. Baby boy Murphy. And I remember thinking, this is the happiest moment of my life. Nothing will ever be better than this. She sobbed. I didn't know it would also be my last moment with you. If I had known, I would have held you tighter, longer. I would have memorized every breath, every heartbeat, every tiny sound you made. Alexander sat down heavily, his carefully constructed walls crumbling. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry for what they did to you." Margaret shook her head. "You have nothing to be sorry for. You were an innocent baby. None of this was your fault." "But I could have found you sooner. I could have searched. You found me now," Margaret said, reaching across to take his hand. "After 35 years, you found me. That's what matters. We found each other." They sat in silence, mother and son, hands clasped across the space that had separated them for more than 3 decades. 3 days later, Alexander drove to Connecticut. The Sterling estate sat on 40 pristine acres in Greenwich. The main house was a colonial mansion, white columns, black shutters, immaculate gardens, the kind of house that appeared in Architectural Digest and Town and Country. Alexander had grown up here, learned to ride horses in these fields, swam in that pool, played tennis on those courts. It all felt like a lie now. Richard and Victoria were having late brunch on the terrace when he arrived. Victoria was reading the New York Times. Richard was on his phone, probably checking stock prices. "Alexander!" Victoria stood, smiling. "What a wonderful surprise. We weren't expecting you until Thanksgiving. Have you eaten? Rosa just made the most divine quiche." "I know what you did." The smile froze on Victoria's face. Her coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. Richard set down his phone slowly, his expression unreadable. "What are you talking about?" "Margaret Sullivan, Mount Sinai Hospital, March 1989. Ring any bells?" The color drained from Victoria's face. The coffee cup slipped from her hand, shattering on the stone terrace. "I want to hear it from you," Alexander said, his voice cold and controlled. "I want you to tell me how you stole a baby from his mother." "Now wait just a minute," Richard began, standing. "No, you wait. I've spent the last week investigating. I have the original hospital records. I have statements from nurses who remember. I have proof of the bribes you paid, the documents you forged, the judge you bought, the lies you told." Victoria was trembling. "Alexander, please." "We gave you a good life," Richard said, his voice hard. "The best schools, the best opportunities. Everything we did was for you. You built your perfect life on someone else's destroyed life," Alexander shot back. "On my mother's destroyed life." "That woman is not your mother," Richard snapped. "We raised you, we fed you, we clothed you, we educated you. We made you who you are today." "You made me a lie," Alexander said. "Everything about my life is a lie. My name, my history, my identity. You stole all of it, and you destroyed an innocent woman to do it." Victoria was crying now. "We couldn't have children. Do you understand? We tried for years. Fertility treatments, specialists, nothing worked. And then we heard about this baby at Mount Sinai. This perfect baby who needed a home. We just wanted to be parents." "So, you destroyed another parent to do it?" Alexander's voice rose. "You took everything from her, her son, her job, her home, her sanity, her entire life. Do you understand what you did? She's been homeless for 35 years because of you." Victoria's hand went to her mouth, her face going pale. "Oh, God," she whispered. "Oh, my God, no." "We didn't know," Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We thought she moved away, started a new life." "You didn't want to know," Alexander corrected. "You got what you wanted, a child, and you didn't care what happened to the woman you stole him from." "Where is she now?" Victoria asked quietly, tears streaming down her face. "She's in Manhattan. I moved her into a hotel. I'm arranging permanent housing, medical care, therapy, everything you took from her." "Alexander, please," Victoria begged. "We love you. We've always loved you. Yes, we made mistakes. Yes, we did terrible things. But we gave you a good life. We gave you opportunities." You had no right. Alexander interrupted. I don't care how much you wanted a child. I don't care how much money you have. I don't care what opportunities you gave me. You had no right to do what you did. Richard's jaw tightened. And what are you going to do about it? The statute of limitations expired decades ago. You can't touch us legally. This is ancient history. You're right, Alexander agreed. I can't prosecute you, but I can do something else. He pulled an envelope from his jacket and placed it on the table. These are the papers to change my name legally. From Alexander Richard Sterling to James David Murphy. I'm filing them tomorrow. Victoria gasped. No, Alexander, please. I'm also stepping down as CEO of Sterling Tech. The board will announce it next week. You can't, Richard started. And I'm selling my shares, Alexander continued. Every single one. The company will be renamed Murphy Innovations. Your name, Sterling, will be completely removed from the business I built. Richard's face turned red. That company is your legacy. Our legacy. Sterling was never my legacy, Alexander said quietly. It was always a lie. Murphy is my real name. Murphy is who I really am. And starting today, that's the only name I'll answer to. He turned to leave, then stopped. One more thing. I'm cutting all financial ties with you. No more trust fund, no more quarterly distributions, no more Sterling money. I'm giving it all back. You're being irrational, Richard began. I don't want anything that came from stolen love. Alexander, no, James said. My mother lost everything because you wanted a child. The least I can do is give up the fortune you built on her suffering. Victoria stood, her voice desperate. Alexander, please. We're your parents. We raised you. Doesn't that mean anything? James looked at her for a long moment. You were my parents, he said softly. But you stopped being that the moment I learned the truth. Parents don't steal children. Parents don't destroy lives. Parents don't build happiness on someone else's pain. He walked toward his car, leaving them standing on the terrace, the ruins of their perfect life crumbling around them. Behind him, he heard Victoria collapse into a chair, sobbing. He didn't look back. 6 months later, James David Murphy stood in front of a modest brownstone in Brooklyn. 3 stories, red brick, a small garden in front. Nothing like the Connecticut mansion or the Central Park penthouse. But it felt like home. Margaret stood beside him, looking up at the building with wonder. This is really ours? It's really ours, James confirmed. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a real kitchen. And look! He pointed to the small garden. We can plant flowers, vegetables, whatever you want. Margaret began to cry. I haven't had a home in 35 years. James put his arm around her shoulders. You have one now. They'd spent the last 6 months rebuilding. Margaret had seen doctors, dentists, therapists. Treating decades of neglect wasn't easy, but she was getting stronger every day. The sharp intelligence in her eyes was matched now by a growing peace in her expression. James had legally changed his name, restructured his company, sold his penthouse and most of his expensive possessions. He'd donated 90% of his sterling inheritance to organizations fighting corruption in the adoption system and helping homeless parents reconnect with children. The media had exploded when the story broke. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, the New York Times, everyone wanted to cover it. Billionaire discovers he was stolen from homeless mother at birth was the headline that went viral.